Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'm going to be sharing a compilation of Bigfoot stories. Happy New Year. Let's get into it. Story 1. I used to drive a truck across the continental 48 states, from Maine to Los Angeles, from Seattle to Miami. I've driven the entire length and breadth of the United States. I drove exclusively overnight. It's my natural schedule anyway, and my driving partner is always appreciated. On this occasion, I was driving my truck through the Appalachian Mountains, quite late at night, somewhere around 3 a.m. I'm drinking a Mountain Dew, listening to an audiobook, Dark Tower 3, The Wastelands, and focusing on the road in front of me. Suddenly, something dashes across the road in front of my headlights. I only see it for a few moments, but then there's something completely wrong with it. It's bipedal. Its head is in line with my windshield, which means it must be 10 feet tall. It's hairy, and while it's human-shaped, there's something off about it that I can't explain. For those brief moments I see it, it looks misshapen, hunched over, all the lines are wrong. And then in a flash, it's across the road and gone, and I can never prove it was ever there. Story 2. August 5th of 2017, Mammoth, California. My ex-fiance and I were avid climbers, hikers, and explorers of the east side Sierra Nevada mountain range, and we decided to go up to Yosemite to climb. Now, Yosemite is stupid crazy to get campsite reservations for, so we decided to stay on BLM land a few miles down from 395 from Mammoth, where we didn't have to pay for camping. We pitched our tent and got settled in. Made dinner, then I went to go set up our trash bag about 1,000 feet from the camp. I don't like having bears close to my tent. It started to rain a little, so we went into the tent and went to sleep around 8:30. It was probably 1:30 in the morning on the 5th. It had stopped raining and I had to take a leak. So I put my flip-flops on and my headlamp, started walking to the spot where I figured it's far enough away that it wouldn't attract anything. Now it had just stopped raining, so when it was dead quiet, I dismissed the silence as everything was hunkered down. So from where I was taking a leak, the trash bag was about 200 yards to my right. As I finished up, I looked to make sure the bag wasn't blown down during the relatively heavy storm that just finished up, and it wasn't in the tree. So I looked at the ground and saw what looked like the biggest black bear I'd ever seen. So I start hollering and screaming and making a lot of noise to scare it off. Then it fucking stood up and looked at me, just covered in hair at about 8 feet at its shoulders, as wide as a meter stick, then ran off. I said, fuck this, I'm going back to the tent, and sprinted the entire way. I get back in the tent and my fiance asked why I was yelling, and I told her I was scaring off a bear from the trash bag. She snuggles back in and falls asleep. I'm wide awake listening contently for any movement when I start hearing footsteps around the car where we kept the food. And then the footsteps started coming towards the tent, and I got scared thinking that this thing, whatever it was, can just come through the tent if it wanted to. It started touching the tent, and I could hear heavy breathing and grunting. Then my fiance wakes up, freaks out thinking it was a bear, and grabs the keys and hits the panic button on the car. Whatever creature ran off. I didn't encounter anything again that trip and played it off to her as it was a bear, and we should probably find somewhere new to camp the next night. On August 5th, we packed up and left early to go climb in Yosemite, and when we came back that night, and the new campsite I approached, another camper that I recognized from the previous night asked me if I noticed anything weird going on the previous night. I told him the story, and he said that he heard my screaming and car alarm, and both times shortly after, something went running at a full gallop through his campsite. While going into his vehicle the next morning, he noticed that there were huge handprints on his cars, on his windows, and he was freaked out enough to move to a new spot as well. He pitched a tent 30 feet from where we were, and we finished camping together the remainder of the trip. I'm not sure what I saw, but the closest thing I can relate it to was Bigfoot. Story 3. My encounter happened back in September of 2002 in southern Illinois. A friend and I, both 16, just returned from seeing the movie Signs in theaters. My friend's house was a good 10-minute drive outside of our town, which was very forested. Later that night, around midnight, we decided to take a walk down an old farm road next to his house that cut right through the woods for about half a mile to an open field in the woods, roughly the size and shape of a football field. We grabbed 2 flashlights and started out into the woods. The whole way out, we were trying to freak each other out since we just got done watching a scary movie. We made our way out to the clearing and were in the corner of the field closest to his house when we heard footsteps coming from the opposite side of the field. Pretty far off. Our crappy condiment flashlights wouldn't reach that far, so we both turned off all our lights, tried to let our eyes adjust to the dark, squatted down. When we turned off the lights, the footsteps stopped too. At this point, we were looking towards the opposite side of the field. A few minutes had passed, and we were talking quietly, trying to figure out who the hell would be in the middle of the woods at midnight. The closest neighbor lived about 3 miles down the road. Suddenly to our right, we hear something massive running at us. This thing had to be huge. The sound of its feet hitting the ground is like nothing I've ever heard to this day. They just had so much weight behind them. The steps sounded bipedal, 1 foot after the other. Our adrenaline kicked in, and I moved faster than I have in my entire life. I literally felt like I was flying. We ran back to his house in a dead sprint and locked the doors. We briefly discussed what happened and went to bed. Strangely, we never spoke about it, really, again. I completely forgot about that night until about 9 years later. I recently got out of the Navy and moved back home. I ran into my friend from that night and he brought it up. He had apparently put a good amount of thought into that night over the years. I wasn't very interested in the topic at that time, so I kind of just shook it off and moved forward in life. Years later, I can't quite figure out what happened that night. There have been a few Bigfoot reports in my area during the same time period. Story 4. Okay, here goes. This is a family story passed down through the generations. They called it the Indian's Devil. All I know is that my great-great-granddad was courting his wife and had to walk 12 miles up the New Ireland Road in Albert County, New Brunswick, Canada. The story was that something jumped out of the trees at him. It had the hands and feet and face of a man, but the body of an ape. It followed him for miles, mocking him and then running away. The local Aboriginal people called it a devil and always told their children to stay close or it might snatch them. They knew this thing, so I asked Grampy what happened. He said that great-granddad was so upset that he took to his bed for 4 days. He then got a bunch of men together and they tracked it down and shot it. I asked Gramps where they buried it and he told me, but I'm not going to put it on the internet. About 2 years ago, I checked the old property deeds and the place where he said it was buried was in existence at the time. I'm guessing in the 1850s. Another friend was telling me that one of his relatives back in the 1930s had a new car. The wheels were really small and not well designed for the snow. They got caught, same region in New Brunswick, in a terrible snowstorm, and to prevent the car from going off the road, someone got out and thought that they would walk alongside the road and kind of guide the car. So he got out and something attacked him. It looked like an ape, but he could not see well as the storm was so vicious. It slashed him across the face and left claw marks across his cheek. He fell back into the car and did not get out again. That's it, folks. That's all I have. I just wanted it documented somewhere. Story 5. About 10 years ago, my family and I were up in the White Mountains of Arizona to cut down our Christmas tree. My dad was driving our truck with my grandpa in the front seat and my mom and sister in the back seat. I was in the bed of the truck along with our family's German short-haired pointer. We were driving along a forest road and all of a sudden my dog starts barking and growling. So I look to see what it is, thinking it as maybe a bear or mountain lion. What I saw was a tall, dark figure walking parallel to the road about 60, 70 yards away. I yelled at my dad to stop the truck. When I told him I think I see Bigfoot, he just laughed and continued to drive. When I looked back to get another look at it, the figure had changed directions and was walking away from the road. The last thing I saw was the thing's head disappearing down a hill. To this day, I still do not have an explanation for what I saw. Every time the situation comes up, my dad always makes me tell everyone my story, just so he can laugh at it. Story 6. I was about 8. My sister was 6 or 7. My family and I had went camping about an hour north of Kingfisher Lake in northern Ontario. It was a routine camping weekend. Fishing, hiking, fires, etc. Well, on the second day we were there, my dad was chopping up some firewood and had asked me to go grab some kindling and to take my sister along. No problem. Off we went. We made it about, I want to say, 100 or so yards away into a small clearing in the woods, within shouting distance if need be. I was gathering twigs and handing them off to my sister when I smelled a smell. The kind of smell that smells smelly. If I had to describe it, it was a mixture of wet dog fur, fish, pine, damp wood, and hot dog shit melting on a city sidewalk. The smell was so bad it made my eyes water, and I suggested we go back, thinking it was a carcass, and if it was a carcass, that means there's predators around. I turned around to tell my sister we're leaving, when I noticed something against a tree in the distance a few meters away. I for sure thought it was a bear, and so I panicked and ran toward my sister to grab her arm and get the fuck out. As I approached, though, I must have startled this thing because what once was just a mass of indistinguishable brown something behind a tree stood up and turned so it was standing profile. I will never ever forget what I saw that day. It is engraved too deeply into my memory that I will carry it with me for the rest of my life. It stood up, and I mean stood up. It had to have been 8 feet tall. Its face was almost human-like, but with 8 features. Sloped brow, protruding lips, and the back of its head was flat, a cone-like shape on the top of, like a gorilla. I was frozen with fear, but I wanted desperately to get out there. I very quietly called to my sister, who was maybe 10 feet away from me at this point, still gathering twigs. "Let's go," Mom called us back. I slowly walked over to her, my eyes locked on this thing the entire time. As soon as I grabbed her hand, it fucking looked at me. It looked at me, and I'm getting shivers typing this. Its eyes were narrowed, black, and terrifying. As soon as it all happened, it was over. It ran faster than anything I've ever seen run into the bush, and that was my ordeal over with. To this day, nobody I tell this story to will believe me, but I don't care. I know I'm not crazy. I know what I saw. I saw a Sasquatch. Story 7. I was in my early 20s in 2008, and I was having a crisis. One of those crises where you think you can only solve it by running away. So my idea was to get all the camping supplies together I could and go live in the woods somewhere down south. I live in Rockford, Illinois. Now all I packed up was one duffel bag and one backpack full of what I thought were decent camping supplies. Would not realize till later that I was way underprepared. So I get out a map and I find any train tracks that lead south, and I was going to follow those as far as I can go. So I find a train track that leads south and I start walking. Before I even get as far as New Milford Road, it's dark, like pitch black. Never did I ever think it would be that dark in the nighttime until there's no street lights around you to help brighten the way. That's when I realized I didn't even bring a flashlight. So I'm walking down the train tracks, get past New Milford Road, get a block or a couple of blocks distance away, and think, okay, this is where I'm going to set up camp for the night. So I take a stick to mark the spot where I stopped on the train tracks and put something on top of it like a pop can. and I walk into the woods off to the side. And I find a little clearing, and I start gathering up as much dry sticks as I can to a little pile and getting some tinder to put underneath it. And it was dead silent. I didn't realize that that was such a bad thing when I didn't hear crickets or any other kind of nighttime animals. And I'm getting my sticks together. I take a little bit of lamp oil and I poured it on the middle of it so I can start it easier, because all I had with me was a crappy lighter. So I'm fumbling around trying to find my lighter, and then a tree about 15-20 feet in front of me that was at least as big as around as a telephone pole, maybe bigger, started shaking. And when I say shaking, it was whipping back and forth like a blade of grass in the wind. A huge tree just moving so easily, and something was coming down it. All I could see was a little bit of moonlight or starlight, whatever it was, through the treetop, and I could just see the tree just shaking back and forth. Then something hit the ground, and I'm sitting there crouched on the ground right in front of where I was hoping to make a fire, and this thing starts barreling towards me. There's nearly waist high weeds, and I can just hear this stuff just ripping out of the way as this thing is tearing right at me. I'm so terrified, I can't move, I can't blink. I'm waiting to die. It gets about a foot in front of me and just stops. I sit and wait, and I wait, and I'm waiting for this thing to grab me or bite me, whatever it is. Nothing happens. I finish fumbling around, find my lighter, reach down in front of me without looking, get a light on the lamp oil, move my hands back. The fire took pretty quickly because of the lamp oil and lit up a good 20 feet around me in no time. And there was nothing there. Absolutely nothing there. Whatever it was, it just vanished. I didn't hear it walk away. I didn't hear anything fly away. After I saw that it was gone, I got a little braver with my fire going and walked around where I heard it coming at me, and checked the ground, tapped my foot around, felt around with my hands looking for a hole in the ground. Maybe it was something that lives in a hole in the ground that I just imagined was bigger, and there was no holes, no nothing. Just a path of weeds knocked out of the way while this thing came at me. I figured, okay, I'm not ready to go live in the woods. This is not for me. Not now, at least. So I stayed there till morning, put my fire out, gathered up my things, walked back up to the train tracks and took a look down the tracks in the direction I was heading, going south, and my jaw dropped. Where I stopped in the middle of the night in the pitch black darkness, I had another 5, maybe 10 feet of walking, and I would have walked right off the edge of a bridge and probably died. So let this be a lesson to you. When life gets you down, running away and living in the woods isn't always the answer. Now, whether it was a Bigfoot or something else, I think it actually saved me. I was about to have a lot worse luck after that, besides walking off of cliffs in the middle of the night and the possibility of giant animals coming out of the trees. My duffel bag strap broke on the way home, and then my backpack straps both broke on the way back home. I wouldn't have gotten very far. That was my own personal account. Story 1. Noted author on bear behavior, Alaskan Larry Knit, writes that he heard an interesting story. It's unconfirmed at this time, but allegedly was written up in Alaska magazine at some point. The story goes like this. Supposedly, a Nome, Alaska pilot and his newlywed wife were en route to Anchorage, where they would make connections for their honeymoon. The weather turned sour, so he touched down in a Cessna 180 or 185 on floats. He taxied to shore, where he and his wife looked for a spot to pitch their tent for the night. Having found one, he turned toward the plane to fetch the tent with his wife following him. He heard his wife scream and turned to see a hairy biped running from the location toward the woods with his wife under one arm. The pilot chased after the critter before realizing that he could best stop it with his firearm and returned to the plane to fetch his rifle. He followed, seeing them 3 times before he lost sight of them. He found a particle of cloth from his wife's garment. He either spent the night in his tent and looked the next day, or flew on to Anchorage and reported the event to the Alaskan state troopers, who began a search but were unable to come up with any positive results. The wife was never found, and I was told that the pilot was distraught in a basket case for years. Story 2. I have read with great interest all of the encounters located at the website, and I would like to add my own experience. It was July of 1967, and myself and 2 very good friends were on an all-night bass fishing excursion on a strip mine pit just west of Farmington, Illinois. The fishing was bad because of intense rain that came and went as the evening wore on. Around 11 p.m., I was standing next to one of the 2 friends when I heard a sound coming from down the gravel road that went by the lake. The sound was coming from quite a distance, and at first I thought it was a katydid, but I was surprised at the volume and realized it was not an insect sound, but something much larger. As the sound drew closer, the volume increased to the point where my friend, who was fishing in the same location as me, stopped reeling his line in and asked, "What is that?" I told him I didn't know, but I noticed that it was getting louder and sounded like it was coming towards us. The sound got louder and louder. It was actually very irritating to the ears. Our other friend finally hollered at us and told us to knock it off. We told him it wasn't us making the noise. We stopped fishing and walked over to where he was standing. By this time the noise was excruciatingly loud, and the frogs and insects had stopped croaking and singing. Suddenly there was the sound of a very large body jumping into the shallow water slough next to the lake where we were fishing in. Whatever it was that jumped in the water began making deep booming sounds in the water by lifting its feet clear of the water and then crashing them back in flat-footed. We just stood there in the pitch blackness and listened until the creature came out of the water on our side of the bank and started making its way through the 8-foot tall reeds between us and him. I walked a few feet away from my friends towards the sound it was making walking through the reeds, and stopped on a footpath that went around that end of the lake and stood there as the creature stepped almost all the way through the reeds. I remember looking up at something that towered over me, but was just a black mass in a mass of tan-colored reeds. I didn't smell anything or see anything clearly, but whatever it was stopped and stood there as though it was looking at me. Instantly, I took off on a dead run around the lake toward a house on the other side of the lake to see if I could get some help for us. When I got to the back porch of the house, I heard a couple more splashes and saw by the dim porch light that my 2 friends had jumped in the water, and one of them had drawn his knife and was hollering for me to get back over there as the thing was standing just a few feet away. I took off running, and when I got to the other side in 20 seconds or so, the creature had backed off and was now in the reeds again. It jumped back in the water and got back out and approached us again, and this time the 3 of us hid underneath an overturned John boat that was lying on the bank. The creature stomped around the boat, and I got the knife from my friend and prepared to stab at any fingers that attempted to lift the boat off of us, but the creature just went back to the slough and jumped back in. It walked up and down the slough for the rest of the night screaming that sound until the sun was about ready to come up, at which time it went back down the gravel road in the direction it had come from and gradually out of hearing. I have heard recorded sounds allegedly made by Sasquatch or Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest on other internet sites, and sound this creature made was very similar, especially considering the intense volume. Our encounter with this creature lasted at least 5 hours, and I will never forget it and the terrorizing effect it had on myself and my friends. This account is true to my best recollection of an event that occurred over 43 years ago, but seems like it was just last week. Story 3. Back in the early 70s, I believe between 1970 and 72, I had an experience that I believe could have been Bigfoot. I lived in the country at the time about 2 miles from the Mackinac River, which is a pretty heavily wooded area. I was sitting on the ground shooting at birds and it was getting dark out. I was about 150 to 200 feet from the barn when all of a sudden the barn door opened and something started coming out. I do not recall any details about what I saw because I was so scared. I do know that whatever it was, it took up the whole space of the barn door. It was dark, so if it was a man, he would have had to have been a large man, and I'm not convinced that is what I saw. I ran into the house right away. I was around 10 or 12 at the time, and we locked the doors. The dogs started barking real soon after I saw whatever it was, and barked for about 3 solid hours, more than I had ever heard them bark before, or have ever heard dogs bark. Nobody else saw it, but a friend saw a shadow go across the barn when he looked out the window. We called the sheriff's office, and a couple of officers went out and looked around, but did not find anything. I wish I'd have just stayed there and got a better look, but I didn't. I cannot recall how much time later, but within a couple months or so, that me and my brother and my cousin found the front half of a pig down about 100 feet from the barn. There were no bones of the missing part of the pig, just a half of a young pig, probably about 6 months old. Something unusual about this is that there were no animals around that could have done this, and if a human was going to do this, I'm sure he would have stolen the whole pig, not just half of it. I have thought about this. It happened around the time Bigfoot was a subject of a lot of sightings in Illinois. In the early 1970s, there were a few sightings reported around this area. I know that this is not a very good report, being that it could have been something else other than Bigfoot. I am not without doubt, but I believe that it may have been Bigfoot more than a human being, and being a Bigfoot enthusiast, I would like to think that it might have been him. Story 4. My name is Anonymous. I've been keeping this secret since around 1986 and didn't know who I could tell without sounding like a nut, but it's been bothering me, and I hope you're the appropriate person to contact regarding this matter. Here's what my wife and I saw. During the late summer of 1986, my wife Mary and I were driving east on Highway 50 heading toward Lake Tahoe at about 11:30 p.m. We were about 25-30 miles west of Lake Tahoe when we approached an S-curve. As we made a right turn, the road curved toward a mountainside and then turned away to the left. While making the right turn, however, our headlights were facing the side of a hill and something else we were not prepared for. About 40 yards directly in front of us, we saw a huge, hairy, man-like creature walking along the side of this hill. At the roadside of our headlights were directly on it, and there was no mistaking what we saw at that distance. As we made the left turn away from the hill, the thing disappeared into the darkness. My wife and I stared off ahead, and as we drove a short distance, both turned to look at each other, and we said, "Did you see that?" I knew I hadn't imagined it because she saw it too. Now the problem was who we could tell without sounding crazy, so we never told a soul, but I've been searching for the right person to tell because it's been eating at me for all these years. I hope you were the right person. Thank you. Story 5. It happened on October 23rd, 1987. While hunting in Azusa Canyon by the experimental forest, I found a game trail with very fresh tracks and followed them to a small stream rain runoff. I started digging up some scorpions to pay for the trip and to take to a pet store to sell when the ground started shaking. I heard a thumping noise that sounded like something very heavy and extremely big was coming my way at a high rate of speed. It was heading downhill in my direction. I moved behind a large boulder for protection and chambered a bullet in my rifle. Shouldering the rifle, I looked through my scope, and that is when I saw it, about 45 yards distance. It was about 8 to 10 feet tall and extremely muscular. I estimated it weighed between 1,300 and 1,700 pounds. It was black, it was not threatening, just staring and wanting to pass. We stood and sized each other up until I backed off. I didn't fire. I am sure my rifle wouldn't drop the thing, it was that large. I continued to back up and then ran toward my truck, having to circle to get back to my truck. There was only 45 yards between us. I was a very young man, ex-bodyguard who could bench 550 pounds. This has forever changed my life. I have run into other people who have seen it. I was sober and I did not do drugs. I have never hunted again. I saw it in the sunlight around noon. Story 6. My girlfriend and I were camping along Highway 128 in Mendocino County, California. We stayed in an area called Hendy Woods. Highway 128 goes north-northwest from Cloverdale on US 101 to the coast near the Albion Fort Bragg area, and Hendy Woods is in the redwood belt between Boonville and the coast. We decided to go to Montgomery Woods one morning, being told it was not a camping area and wouldn't have the motorhomes and kid-filled campsites, and the trees preserved there were spectacular. We arrived at Montgomery Woods about 8 a.m. and were going to hike the self-guided trail. The parking area is small, and it looked like we were the first, if not the only ones there. It was a cool, foggy September day. About a half hour into the hike, my girlfriend thought she heard someone on the trail behind us. We stopped and waited, but there was no noise. We continued to the base of a huge redwood, sat to rest. The redwoods are an eerily quiet place, with the thick, soft redwood bark and ankle-deep tree leaves and needles absorbing lots of ambient sound. Suddenly we heard something moving through the undergrowth 20 or 30 yards away from the canopy of trees. It was big, heavy, and moving at a good pace. I whistled, and the movement stopped. This was as scared as I've ever been. It was silent for a minute or so, then the movement continued. Whatever it was so close, and I was frustrated that I could only see brush moving, but not the creature. It stopped moving about 100 feet or so away, then let out a scream that would scare the dead. We froze, thinking this was it. From behind us, several hundred yards to the west, came a similar scream, as if responding to the first. We looked back, but couldn't tell where exactly it came from. Then the first creature screamed again, louder and longer than the first time. I can't tell you how loud it was. The lung capacity was enormous. I can remember thinking that we might be surrounded, and that we might die here. Suddenly, the first creature started to move, not away, but parallel to the trail. There was a bit of a clearing, and we saw the left side of a 7-foot-tall, hair-covered biped. I've met Shaquille O'Neal at the LA airport, and this thing was so much bulkier, huge through the chest and shoulders. I only saw the left arm, and the wrist was the diameter of my biceps. It looked at us for 2 or 3 seconds, then returned to its right and hustled down the ravine. We looked through the trees to follow its progress, but we had waited a minute or two, and it was gone. Story 7. In 1959, age 22, I was hitchhiking from Biggs, Oregon, down US Highway 97 to Klamath Falls. About halfway through the trip, I was picked up by a man who asked if I planned to do any camping in the Cascades. I said no. He said good, because there are things up there that will kill you quick. I said, "You mean grizzlies?" Which I had seen in Yellowstone. "No," he replied, "not grizzlies." And he told me this story, which I am paraphrasing. I used to work for a company that builds logging roads. One day we got a report that one of our roads, he didn't say where, had washed out. I went out in my truck to find out what would be needed to fix it. About 3 or 4 miles from the highway, I noticed a rocky outcropping and something glinting in the sun. I was an amateur prospector, always looking for signs of a strike. I stopped my truck, took out my rock hammer, and walked up to the outcropping, which was about 10 feet high. I started chipping away at the rock, trying to get a sample. When I stopped hammering, I heard a clicking sound from the bushes across the road, about 60 feet away. It sounded like someone knocking 2 stones together. I wasn't afraid because I had a .45 on my hip, so I resumed chipping. When I stopped, again I heard the clicking sound, which was louder. I yelled toward the bushes, saying, "Come out and show yourself." I started chipping again, and suddenly a stone the size of a grapefruit smashed into the rock face about 3 feet from my head. If it had hit me, it would have killed me. I dropped my hammer, pulled my .45, and picked up the stone, which was rolling across the road. I tried to throw it back into the bushes, but it was so heavy I could only toss it 7 feet. Scared and angry, I crossed the road, shouting curse words, and fired a shot in the air. At that point I heard something moving rapidly through the bushes and fading away alongside the road. I continued watching in that direction, and suddenly there it was, a black, hairy, 2-legged being, sort of bent over but moving fast. Then it was gone, just like that. I looked around in the bushes and saw a few broken branches, but nothing else. But there was a terrible stink in the air. I got into my truck and drove back to the highway in a hurry. A couple of years later, I told a friend what happened, and he knew all about these creatures. He said they don't hurt people, which I didn't believe for a second, and the stone was thrown in my direction was probably just a warning. He also said the creatures don't usually smell bad, but when they are mad or frightened, they spray some kind of stinky liquid, like a skunk does. That was it. I had never heard of Bigfoot before that, and did not believe the story, thinking he was pulling the leg of a dude from the east, but I pretended to believe him because he was giving me a free ride in his truck. It wasn't until many years later I began hearing reports about Bigfoot and remembered the story I heard in Oregon. I still wonder if it might be a hoax of some kind. Welcome to Real Rockford Files, for tales of the paranormal, supernatural, and the flat-out unbelievable. Today I'll be sharing Bigfoot stories. Let's get into it. Story 1. The province of Darien, located to the southeast extreme of the Panamanian territory bordering Colombia. It has an extensive rainforest and many different Indian cultures of Afro-Saharan descent brought into the area originally by the Spanish. Then there is Panama's sultry Darien Gap. It's a 10,000 square mile swath of stinking, impenetrable jungle on the border of Central and South America, known through the ages for swallowing explorers. Today, the contrabandista guerrillas, drunken men with machetes and broken bottles, line the thoroughfares with drug smugglers and poachers. If those don't get you, the large population of jaguars and deadly bushmasters will. This is one of nature's untold no man's land. Marsh's story of the man-beast of Darien follows. In 1920, while I was in Panama, an old and experienced American prospector, Shay by the name, came to me with a strange story. He had just returned from a trip to southeastern Darien with another American he had ascended the Sambu River with, which enters the sea on the southern shore of San Miguel Bay. The country here was, and still is, wholly unknown. Even the mountain range back from the coast did not appear on the maps. Shay and his companion worked their way with great difficulty to the headwaters of Sambu, and there they became separated. The other American has not been heard from since. When Shay lost his companion, he lost his canoe and most of his equipment. So instead of attempting to return down the Sambu River, he decided to forge his way to the Pacific Ocean across the Andean Range to the west. He reached the divide in a state of exhaustion, and by a stroke of luck stumbled on an old Indian dugout abandoned on the bank of a small river running into Pinus Bay. It was nearly dark, so he camped for the night at a considerable altitude not far from the divide. All that night he heard the footsteps of a large animal in the jungle above his camp, and when dawn came, he heard a curious chattering sound. He looked up and saw standing on top of the bank an animal that appeared to his unscientific mind to be a cross between a black person and a gigantic ape. It was 6 feet tall, walked erect, weighed possibly 300 pounds, and was covered with long black hair. It was glaring down at him and chattering its teeth in rage. Shay whipped out his revolver and shot it through the head. It tumbled down the bank and lay still beside his canoe. When Shay recovered from his fright, he measured the animal crudely. It was heavily built like a gorilla, but the big toes on the feet were parallel with the other toes, as in a human being, not opposed like thumbs, as in all other monkeys and great apes. Unfortunately, Shay was too exhausted to bring any part of the animal back to the civilization. He barely managed to get down to Pinus Bay on the Pacific and attract the attention of a coaster, which took him to Panama, more dead than alive. I saw him many times after that in the hospital, where he eventually died of chronic malaria. Almost his last words were a solemn oath that the story of the man-beast was true. Of course, my first reaction to this story was extreme skepticism, but I found to my surprise that many trustworthy men who had penetrated into the little-known parts of tropical America did not share my disbelief. The man-beast is reported to have been seen in many locations. A Spanish gold hunting expedition in the 17th century reported that it had shot 14 of the man-beasts not far from his same Pinus Bay. The Indians from Ecuador to Nicaragua assert that the creatures inhabit isolated jungle-covered mountains, as do the gorillas in Africa. Nothing will persuade an Indian to spend the night on such a peak. When I returned to Washington and mentioned the matter to Dr. Hu of the Smithsonian, I did not get the pitying smile I was expecting. On the contrary, he said he had been getting reports of this sort for 20 years and was inclined to believe there was something in them. Story 2. My name is the Morn Rat, and I wish to share with you my encounter with, I shall say, an ape man in Thailand. This totally surreal, baffling, but unique experience happened when I was 6 or 7. I'm now 35, but remember every single detail like it happened yesterday. In a tiny village in southern Thailand called Phai Bun in the county of Nakhon Sri Thammarat. Phai Bun is tiny, just a handful of houses on wooded stilts. A temple and a river ran behind the houses. One day while visiting my cousins, I lived in the neighboring village of Klong Chandi, I noticed that a crowd had gathered outside one of the houses a few doors down from where I was. I knew that house also served as a coffee shop. I witnessed to this day something that I never thought I would ever share with strangers, for fear of people thinking I'm crazy. I saw perhaps 4 Thai soldiers, and 2 of them had what looked like a long leash, which led to handcuffs, and then 2 ape-like creatures. In detail, they were tall, must have been 6 foot, walking upright like us, had dark fur, same color as a chimpanzee, features of a chimpanzee, but the eyes like humans. I know it sounds corny, but the only accurate way to describe them is that they look like the creatures from the Planet of the Apes. They seemed to be both male, though I couldn't be 100% sure, but the soldiers dressed them in jeans and long-sleeved blue shirts, if I remember correctly. They were sipping hot, sweet tea with a small spoon like a human. There was a crowd around them. They didn't seem too bothered. To me, it seemed like they were used to the attention. They didn't act like how I presume an ape would act. I would say they leaned more towards the human side in their behavior. I was too young then to ask what or who they were. I suppose due to the initial response of the villagers, it was their first time to have witnessed them too. I remember that some of them asked the soldiers questions, but I can't recall what was said. I asked my cousins about them too. They don't know anything about it. The 2 ape-like creatures seemed like they were used to humans. This is looking back. They didn't seem to mind us crowding around them. As I said, they were sipping Thai tea, which served in a glass cup. They knew how to pick up a spoon, stir tea, then spoon the tea into their mouths rather than picking it up and drinking it. I presume they must have been captured for a while. They seemed to be at ease around us, though barely took notice of us. They wore clothing, they walked like us. They were not huge, not gorilla-like in their physique. No big heads, no huge shoulders like some of the pictures I've seen while researching on the net. They were like men with a chimpanzee mask, or half man, half chimpanzee is the best way to describe them. I do remember that they didn't seem to have hair on their face, maybe around the face frame and the protruding ape-like mouth. Human-like eyes, dark, but it was the eyes I remembered the most. I remember vividly seeing pain in one of their eyes. Their hair was black because they had a long-sleeved shirt and jeans on. You can only see so much. The crowd had packed into this tiny shop, and I remember the room was dark from the many bodies straining to see them. Who knows where soldiers were taking them or what they were doing with them. I went back to the village of Faibun for the first time after many, many absent years in 2004, and sadly a lot of the houses had either been flooded away or had been burnt down by a wildfire that happened many years ago. My cousins still keep in contact with some people from there. I shall do my utmost to find out about them. I made a promise to myself to find out about my friends, wherever they are. I will be going back again next year, so I shall keep you updated. Also, they must have come from an army base nearby. Someone out there knows them. Hope the info helped. I do feel better having shared this experience with people. Though my husband loves me very much, I think he gave me a very funny glance when I told him about it. Few people that I can share this with, and who better than those who believe it too. The soldiers didn't seem threatened or bothered by them. After drinking their tea, they left. I remember watching one of them sip his tea with his spoon. The sad look in his eyes I'll never forget. Never. To this day, if I could find them again, I would want to free them. Goodness knows where they came from, what happened to them, but I do know that the Thai army had something to do with it. We are talking about a tiny little community in the deepest, thickest part of the southern Thailand. No one would have the money to pay for a practical joke like that. Though I never thought of researching to see if there was an army base nearby, somebody out here knows about them. Sadly, I feel that perhaps they were killed, as I have not heard anything about them anymore, but who knows? I pray and hope not. Story 3. My name is Nicholas McCain. I grew up in Dixie, Washington, and am now 23 years. My story takes place about a year and a half ago. It was early August when my friends invited me to go camping for a weekend with them. The place was in the Umatilla National Forest, about 3 miles past Jubilee Lake. Motet Campgrounds is in Oregon. It's a beautiful area and plenty of places to go hiking. Later in the evening, after eating a great meal of venison, elk, and moose a friend brought, which may have very well helped get their attention on the last day, it was just my friends Jordan, Josh, and I still awake around the fire with a number of people sleeping around in their tents. I was resting on a cot about 5 feet away from the fire and about 20 feet away from the edge of the woods that the soon coming noise would come from. It was somewhere around 11:30 p.m. Jordan gets up from his chair and walks over to the edge of the tree line nearest me to relieve himself. In the middle of doing so, there was a sudden growl, snorting noise that came from about 15 yards into the trees. This was enough to cut off Jordan in midstream and run backwards to the fire. Josh and I were on our feet within the blink of an eye, and I, without even realizing it, grabbed my knife off to my side. All of us pretty much at the same time started looking at each other and started to question as to whether or not we all heard the same thing and what the F could that possibly have been. We all grew up in a little town of Dixie, only a couple of miles from being right in the blues, and we were all well aware of what kind of animals they expect, having spent many nights in the mountains. We were not impaired in any way, having partied a little too hard the last few nights and having to be up early to leave the next day. After about a minute, Jordan and I ran back to our tent to grab the machete and the big flashlight. We inspect the woods as best we can from about 5 feet in. After seeing nothing right away, we started smacking trees and yelling, basically making a hell of a racket in case it was a cougar or something. We figured whatever it was would run away if we made enough noise and whatnot. After doing that, we made the fire up a bit bigger and made sure to have some branches sticking out just in case we had to throw them. We all calmed down after about 20 minutes or so and went back to regular chit-chat. An hour and 15 minutes goes by when out of nowhere and from the same spot we heard the last noise, we hear a roar and a sudden smashing of what sounds like large hammers on wood and tree branches violently snapping and a thud, 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 and then complete silence. In about 6 thuds that we were able to hear, it traveled about 35 to 40 yards. While this was happening, we all stand back up and start screaming, "What the F? What was that?" So on and so forth, not willing to even go near the edge of the woods. One of the people sleeping in the tent nearest to everything comes bolting out, squealing her head off and freaking out, wanting to know what was going on as well. This was enough to get the guy with the 44 out of bed and whatnot, but by the time he was there, nothing really left he can do. A good half an hour goes by, and he finally goes back to sleep as well as Casey, the one who was sleeping nearest to the ruckus, and the 3 of us go back to sitting around the fire. 20 minutes later, we hear the sounds, like a thud, 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 only further away in the distance and walking away. We at that point are exhausted and decided to go to sleep. It just so happens that we all were sleeping in a 4-person tent, and it just so happens that the zipper on the door was broken, so it was flapping open all night and day long. When we awoke the next day, all 3 of us had about 2 to 5 pine cones around our heads. I know the door on the tent was broken, but there's just no damn way we all dragged in that many pine cones all the way by our heads. I found a very large footprint outside our tent, and when examining the area where all the noise had happened the night before, there were two 10 to 15 foot trees broken in 2 spots as if something had grabbed it with 2 hands and bent it over with ease. From here forward, I know that Bigfoot exists, and although that was as scared as I've ever been in my life, I must go back and search. One day, one of us who believe will get that proof we've all been searching for. Story 4. This happened 30 years ago at age 5, while camping with my sister and parents at Salt Creek Falls, Oregon, on Highway 58, just past the tunnel. A large being sat down on our campsite and ate some chicken out of a bucket we'd left out. This was in the middle of the night. My parents were sleeping in a nearby tent, and my sister and I were on cots out in the open. As I said, I was 5 years old, and my sister was 10. The next morning, my sister and I were out exploring and playing on the lava flows. Something scared my sister, and she pushed me down and ran. I suffered a gash to the side of my head. Someone or something picked me up and carried me like a baby. He or it carried me back to the campsite and placed me on my cot. My parents weren't there, and when they came back from looking for me, they asked me how I found my way back. I told them a bear carried me back. I told them that it walked, carrying me in its arms. I remember that it was all hairy and wore no clothes. It looked like the same thing that was eating the chicken the night before. Haven't seen anything like this since. I'll leave it to you, but looking back, I think it was a Bigfoot. Maybe it would have been worthwhile to check the area for other sightings. Story 5. My name is Eric. I would like to post this that I read somewhere else about a Bigfoot that was sighted in Burrillville, Gloucester State Forest in Rhode Island. At around 2 in the morning, a student decided to pull into George Washington State Park. He got out to sit and relax because his truck was too old for air conditioning. It was in the summer of 2002 when he heard some grunts, yells, and heavy footsteps coming toward him. He soon thought it was time to go, so he got back into his truck. At the same instant, when he opened the door, he smelled a horrible smell like a wet dog or a rotten egg type smell. Anyways, he pulled further into the park to turn. When he got halfway down the dirt road, he saw what looked like a reddish-brown, furry human walking directly in front of him. It looked totally like an ape that was walking upright like a human. This scared him so much he took off home. I wanted to tell you this report because I live extremely close to the park. The only difference is that I live on the Burrillville side of the forest instead of the Gloucester side where the sighting has occurred. There is also a number of trails that go through the state park, and I have hiked half of the trails. There is one trail that I hiked that went into Connecticut. Very cool trails. But during some of these hikes that I go on, I feel like someone is watching me, even though there is hardly anyone there. Anyways, I get very nervous at some point when I'm out there in the woods, but after a while it would go away. I also wanted to let you know I'm a firm believer in Bigfoot and want to support other Bigfoot websites and stories so people can pass them on to the next person. Story 6. I live in the town of Kalama, which is located on I-5 in Cowlitz County, Washington, between Kelso and Woodland. Kalama is named after a Hawaiian man who came here and married the daughter of a Nisqually chief, or so the story goes in these parts. Small towns always have stories. As a lad, I worked at the local fish hatchery, but I'm retired and on disability now and would appreciate my name not being used. I want to relate a second-hand story that was told to me, probably not factual, but persistent. The story goes, there was a man present in the Kalama saloon, I won't name the bar, when suddenly a wild-eyed and scared Washington State Fisheries employee rushed in and asked for a double shot on the rocks. This Washington State Fisheries employee, not me, but someone I know in this town, said the man in the bar worked at the Kalama River Fish Hatchery, that I would know his name. For the sake of the story, I'll call him Joe. Joe had been enjoying his days off by camping alone on the upper Kalama River, which is beautiful country, pristine in places. On his first night, Joe built a campfire and gathered firewood in preparation for spending several days in the area. Not long after the sun went down, he heard movement in the nearby underbrush, just outside the ring of light provided by the campfire. According to the story, this man we refer to as Joe said he could hear grunting, heavy breathing, and sounds of tree limbs being broken off or snapped off. He could also hear heavy footsteps but never saw anything. He kept feeding his campfire more wood. He told folks that he was firmly convinced that keeping the fire going all night had saved him. He stayed awake through the night, with the intruder leaving just before dawn. At first light, he got on his trail bike and left for Kalama, leaving behind his tent, sleeping bag, his tackle, and other top-notch gear. They asked him if he was going back for his camping equipment, said to have been some expensive gear, but Joe replied, no, they could have it. Now, I would believe this to be a bear or elk story, were it not for the number of huge barefooted footprints that were found, 12 to 14 inches long, half as wide, and very human-like. 2 Kalama men went to the area to retrieve Joe's camping gear for him, say they found these tracks, which left them troubled. In addition, they found broken off tree branches, some 2 inches in diameter, that was some distance above the ground, which could have been done by bear cubs up a tree were it not for so many of them been broken. They returned Joe's gear to him, and to this day he's never been back. Odd for a fellow known to be a woodsman. That's it, probably just a bar story. Nobody knows for sure when this occurred. The story has been around for years. Story 1. Claiborne County, Alabama, 1994. About 14 years ago, my wife and I were at a lake in the middle of Talladega National Forest in Alabama. The lake was Sweetwater Lake. From I-20, you get off at the Heflin exit and go through Heflin and get on Highway 78. You'll see signs directing you to Pine Glen, a camping area, and Coleman Lake soon after this point. The roads are dirt roads, but follow the signs to Pine Glen, and about 3 miles up the road on the left you'll see a sign for Sweetwater Lake. This road will go down about half a mile to the lake. It was September 1994. We were fishing in a small boat at the end of the slough early in the morning. We were the only ones at the lake. I think it was on a Wednesday, and we were all alone. We heard something scream. It started out as a howl and turned into a long, high-pitched scream, and it was so loud it echoed through the mountains. It made the hair on the back of our necks stand up. But that is not all. About a year before that, my stepfather and I were hiking around the same lake. We like to fish at a spillway way on the back side of the lake, and about a half mile into the hike, we crossed a fire break about 20 feet wide. Now keep in mind that we are a pretty good way back in the woods. We have crossed rock thorns and briars and all kinds of rough ground. And right there across the dried mud in the fire break is a set of footprints, dried in the mud. They were not huge, they were about the size of a full-grown man, but they did not look human. I just couldn't understand why a man would be this far back in the woods without shoes on anyway. And over the years, there's one thing I have thought about. A Bigfoot would have to grow up, so maybe it was a young Bigfoot. I once worked with a man in Alabama that, after we became friends, told me he and his whole family were picking huckleberries at Sweetwater Lake. The huckleberries grow wild all over the area. He and his wife and 2 children were picking away when they all heard something in the trees. They all turned around to see a hairy man standing there. He said it was a little taller than a man, and as soon as he saw them, it ran off into the woods, and it scared them so bad they left right away. Story 2. The spring of 1900 found 4 men batching together in a shack at Wrangell, Alaska. All 4 were broke, as is usual with prospectors. As luck would have it, I was one of the 4. For reasons which will be quite obvious, I'll just call the other 3 John, Charlie, and Fred. Charlie came into the shack one night in April, all excited, and said, "Fellows, I've been on the trail of an old Indian for the last month trying to get him to tell me where he picked up a piece of free gold quartz he has at his camp." I never said anything about it before because I wanted to get the story from him first, and today he spilled the beans. He told me to go up to Thomas Bay and camp on Patterson River on the right side, travel up river for about 8 miles, and then turn to the high mountains. And after traveling about a mile and a half, I would find a lake shaped like a half moon. Plenty of stone like I found on a slide there, he said. Thomas Bay is known by the Native Americans in Alaska as the Bay of Death. About 150 years ago, a slide down one of the mountains wiped out a village, killing over 500 of the inhabitants. Well, of course a prospector is ready to stampede on a whisper of gold any place, and we were no exceptions to the rule. We all talked the matter over, and finally it was decided that we would run our faces for an outfit and send Charlie to look the prospect over. While he was gone, John, Fred, and myself would hustle work somewhere for another grub stake and to pay the old one off. The forepart of May, Charlie loaded his outfit into a canoe and, having favorable weather, left Wrangell for Thomas Bay, which lies northwesterly about 50 miles. He had 3 months' supplies, but was to come back any time sooner if he found anything. But if he didn't show up in that time, we were to put out a search for him. John and Fred took a contract to get out wood, and I got a job in the Wrangell sawmill. Things went along until the first part of June, when on a Sunday in the late afternoon, we all being home, and in walks Charlie without a coat or hat, looking as if he had been through hell. He didn't give us any greeting whatsoever, just heaved a piece of quartz over into the corner of the room and said, "Get me something to eat. I'm all in and want to rest." The fellow looked ill, and after he had eaten, he turned in without telling us a thing about his trip. We picked up the piece of quartz and said, "Boy, it sure was a pretty thing to look at for a prospector." It was shot through with gold specks, just like a badly freckled-faced kid. Were we excited? I'll say we were. Just before dark, we walked down to the beach to bring Charlie's outfit, as he had come up to the shack with only that piece of quartz in his hand, but there wasn't a thing in the canoe, except the oars. Not much sleep for us that night, but Charlie never stopped sawing wood. He had hard work getting Charlie up for the breakfast the next morning, but when he did roll out, he just ate, borrowed a coat and hat, and left the house without saying a word or even answering one question of the many put to him by us. All of us being excited and feeling ourselves worth a fortune, Did not go to work that day, but sat around the shack and passed around that blamed piece of rock back and forth to each other while we talked and waited for Charlie to come back and make his report. Believe me, we were anxious to hear it. Along in the afternoon he came in and said, "Fellows, the SS Drigo will be in on her way south early tomorrow morning. Can you give me enough money for my ticket to Seattle? I'm through with Alaska and never want to see it again. I'll tell you about my trip to Thomas Bay and where I found that quartz, but my advice to you is to forget about it. It will never do you any good. It will only cause you a lot of mental and physical pain. If we were not partners, I would never open my lips about this trip or what I found. But if you promise never to mention my name in connection with what I tell you, or mention the name of Thomas Bay to me again, I'll give you the straight of my experience up there. Judge for yourselves as to my sameness, because this is the most astounding thing you have ever heard, and as far as I'm concerned, is beyond me to reason it out. Don't ask any questions to prolong my story any further than it takes to tell it, as I want to leave Alaska and forget it if I can. I'll try to make the one telling plain enough. The first night after leaving Wrangell found me at Ideal Cove. Next night I reached Muddy River in time to make camp again. The third night I hit Ruth Island in Thomas Bay. I spent the next day looking up Patterson River for a suitable place for a good camp, which I found a quarter of a mile from Tidewater on the right-hand side, looking up the river. Broke camp on Ruth Island the next day and moved up to the place I picked out the day before. Put up my tent, packed up my outfit, and left the canoe on the river bank. The next day I spent cooking beans, cutting wood, and making things comfortable for a long stay. As it looked like rain, I wanted to get things fixed to keep dry. It started to rain that night, and I just kept it up for days. I lost track of time, as each day was just like the one before. Had nothing to read, was all alone, couldn't do anything without getting soaked, and the roar of the fire and wind through the timber just drove me nuts, so I put in most of my time sleeping. Finally the weather broke, and I got out, spent several days in trying to find the old Indians' Half Moon Lake, but couldn't get it spotted. I did find, about 2 miles from camp up the river, and about a mile from it, a lake shaped like the letter S. On the creek coming out from the lower end, I panned some pretty good colors, but, as I figured, not enough to get excited about. Yet an indication of gold in the country. Talk about a dead country, that sure is. There doesn't seem to be any life in there at all. You might spend all day in the timber without seeing a squirrel. I was getting sort of tired of beans, rice, and bacon, so I made up my mind I would go over the ridge about 8 miles east of the S Lake and get a few grouse, as I thought I could hear a few hooters up there when I was at the head of this lake. I left come the next morning, which was a fine sunny day. I took only the rifle with me, and when I came to the ridge, sure enough, there were a few grouse hooting. I shot 2 and had gotten them when I bagged another one, which fell down the ridge about 100 yards before it hung up. While on my way down to pick it up, I found that piece of quartz. Up to that time, I had paid very little attention to what the country I was in looked like, as it was so heavily timbered and brushy. The formation didn't show up, and I had no tools with me to uncover it. The top of an old snag had broken off and fallen, scraping the top moss and loose dirt for a space about 8 feet wide and 18 or 20 feet long, uncovering this quartz ledge, which is where I found this piece. This ledge was worked smooth by a glacier at one time. I couldn't find anything to break a piece off with, so I used the butt of my gun to get that piece. In doing so, I broke the stock of my gun, thus ruining it for further use. This didn't worry me any, as I knew there was not game in the country larger than a grouse, and damned few of them. My first thought was of the richness of the quartz, and of you fellows, and getting back to town to round you all up so we can get busy on it. After looking over and enjoying the feeling of knowing I had made a rich find, I covered the ledge up again with the moss, limbs, and rotten chunk. Finishing that job, I thought I would climb the ridge directly over the ledge and get my landmarks. so I could come back to it again or tell you where it was if anything should happen to me. This I did, climbing straight up over the ledge and on a ridge till I reached the top, which was about 600 feet above where I found the ledge. I looked down below me and picked out a big tree with a bushy top, taller than the rest, and about 50 feet to the right of the ledge. Looking over the top of this tree from where I stood, I could see out on Frederick Sound, Cape of the Straight Light, the point of Vanderput Spit, Point Vanderput, and turning a little to the left, I could see Sequoia Island, Kodiak, from the mouth of Wrangell Narrows. Satisfied with that, I turned half around to get a backside on some mountain peaks, and lying below me on the other side of the ridge from the ledge was the half-moon lake the Indian had told me about. Right there, fellows, I got the scare of my life. I hope to God I never see or go through the likes of it again. Swarming up the ridge toward me from the lake were the most hideous creatures. I couldn't call them anything but devils, as they were neither men nor monkeys, yet looked like both. They were entirely sexless, their bodies covered with long coarse hair, except where the scabs and running sores had replaced it. Each one seemed to be reaching out for me and striving to be the first to get to me. The air was full of their cries, and the stench from their sores and bodies made me faint. I forgot my broken gun and tried to use it on the first ones. Then I threw it at them and turned and ran. God, how I ran! I could feel their hot breath on my back. Their long claw-like fingers scraped my back. The smell from their steaming, stinking bodies was making me sick, while the noises they made, yelling, screaming, and breathing, drove me mad. Reason left me. How I reached the canoe, or how I hung on to that piece of quartz, is a mystery to me. When I came to, it was night, and I was laying in the bottom of my canoe, drifting between Thomas Bay and Sequoia Island, cold, hungry, and crazy thirsty, but only to satisfy the latter urge. I started for Wrangell, and here I am. You no doubt think I'm either crazy or lying. All I can say is, there's the quartz. Never let me hear the name of Thomas Bay again, and for God's sake help me get away tomorrow on that boat. So passed out Charlie from our lives. We put his story down as a fantasy caused by loneliness and morbid thought. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 3. This is a story my mother told me a few times while I was growing up. I recently asked her to tell me the story again so that I could post it online. I would appreciate any thoughts on what it could have been. My mother was one of the 12 children who were turned over to an orphanage in Turnagain, Alaska, about 30 miles outside of Anchorage. There were no other children in this home, and it was apparently run or managed by a priest. We do not know the year the children were surrendered to the orphanage. In or around 1955, my mother would have been around 7 years old. The bedroom assigned to the female children was in the attic, with an attic storage access door leading from either side of this bedroom. There were 4 children in this room, 2 of which slept on a bunk bed, and 2 on a full-size bed. My mother was on the top bunk. The people who ran the orphanage had started saying to the children that if they saw or heard anything upstairs in their room, to wake them up immediately and they would kill it. My mother's sisters had told her several times that if she ever saw the creature, to not be afraid, it would not harm her. She thought they were trying to scare her. One night my mother was awakened by a noise. As she looked down from her top bunk, she saw a small creature walking upright across the room. She describes it as no more than 2.5 or 3 feet tall, shaped like a human, completely covered in a very dark long hair, with limbs not disproportionate with its body. Because it was night, she was only able to make out features as the moonlight through the window allowed. She was not able to clearly see a face, hands, and feet. She watched this creature in terror while it walked around the room. She saw it struggling to reach the covers on the lower beds to apparently cover the children up. When the creature started trying to climb to the top bunk where my mother was, she yelled, "Stay away from me." When she did this, the creature appeared shocked that she was awake and that she yelled at it. It abandoned its attempt and climbed the bunk, and was later seen by my mother trying to take the skeleton key out of the bedroom door. It apparently really wanted that key because it stood there a long time trying to get it out of the door, but never succeeded. She did not see the creature leave the room. However, one of the attic storage doors was out of her line of vision. A few weeks later, the children were told to bring some army rations out of the attic storage space. When they went to retrieve them, they found several ration cans opened and discarded in the far corner of one of those spaces. She thinks there were more than 12, but less than 20. None of the children had reason to sneak food, so they were not likely suspects for the presence of the empty cans. That was the only encounter my mother had with the creature, much to her relief. My mother isn't one to tell fantastic stories. She is now 60 years old, educated, and very hard worker. She has no illnesses and takes no medication. She has never told any other wild tales. She has also never tried to seek any attention with this story. In fact, there are only a very few people she has ever told it to. My mother was adopted when she was 9 and taken from her siblings to Oklahoma. She never again saw or spoke to her siblings until 1997, where she had purely chance encounter with an older brother at a tribal meeting. When they began talking, they did not know they were siblings until one of them mentioned having grown up in an orphanage in Turnagain, Alaska. It didn't take many more sentences after that for them to learn that he was the child born before her. Within hours of this meeting, while they were still talking about the orphanage, I asked my uncle if he remembered seeing the creature. His face lit up, and he described in detail the same creature my mother had. They had only been talking for a few hours and did not have time to coordinate a fabricated story. I had always wondered what this creature was, and so had my mother. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. Kodiak resident Dana Jacallin is sure he'd had several encounters with what some Alaska natives call hairy man, the creature known in the Pacific Northwest as Bigfoot. He's also sure the creatures have given him a distinct message: leave us alone. Jacallin's fascination with the creatures goes back to a cold morning in 1979 in the remote Itolen Island area near Wrangell. He and his hunting partner were hoping to harvest some of the deer they knew inhabited an alpine meadow at the head of the fjord. Jacallin wrote the following about his experience. The deer we were hunting were at an elevation of about 700 feet. We arrived in the inlet just before dark in the late fall. My partner did not trust the anchorage or the weather, so he opted to stay on the boat, while I climbed up to where we knew the deer would be spending the night. I found a bench and folded myself up in a large piece of visqueen in my sleeping bag on a small outcropping about 8 feet above a well-worn trail. My friend was to meet me at this spot before dawn the next morning, and we knew we would bag some deer easily in the nearby meadow just after it got light enough to see. We had seen deer here several times, but had never taken advantage of the fact. Just before I went to sleep, I remember seeing the mast light on the boat in the inlet and imagining the boom hung with our limit of deer. I was awakened before dawn. Around 1 o'clock, my sleeping bag was jerked out from under me. Instantly, like the magician does with the tablecloth and the glass, I awoke in the moment it happened, curled into a fetal position and freezing my fanny. I laid there for a few seconds, trying to figure out what had happened. I figured something had either happened to the boat, or my pal had somehow spotted a trove of fat deer. I sat up and pulled on my boots, looking for my mate to explain what was going on. I was still not fully awake, but for fear of scaring the deer, I refrained from calling to my friend. It had snowed almost an inch since I went to sleep, and peering over the ledge, I could see people tracks in the snow leading up the hill toward the meadow. I grabbed my rifle and slogged down the trail, peering at the ground in the dark, and wondering how and why my somewhat elderly companion had chosen that unusual method of rousing me from the sack. I was stepping in the footprints in the snow. They were dark and easy to see, and was starting to think my partner had not been the one to zip my bag out from under me. Then realization struck me, and I was gripped with fear. The tracks I was so carefully stepping in were not human. They were the imprints of bare feet, but almost twice the size of my own size 10 boots. This is not real, I thought. I could hear nothing except the snowflakes falling gently to the ground. Every hair on my body was erect, sensing the air for the obvious logical solution. I cannot shoot anything, I told myself. This is a very carefully planned prank, and all I need to do is lose my control and end up hurting someone. I double-checked the safety on the rifle and determined that this joke was going to be on them. Cool as a cucumber, I walked another few steps up the hill where I would be able to see the crest of the rise on my own. There was a large hemlock tree here, and I decided to climb it and wait out the pranksters who were trying to scare me out of my wits. Checking the sky, I noticed that within a few minutes the clouds would reveal the full moon, providing me with enough light to see what was going on. I took a few more steps, marveling at the perfection that these guys had achieved with the footprints. Then I knew it was no joke. I felt an unmistakable sense of warning, as clearly as if someone had spoken. It wasn't logic, it wasn't fear, it was communication. I stopped and looked up. 15 feet away, one hand on his hip, the other gripping a branch of the hemlock that was just above my head, was the biggest, hairiest guy on two legs I ever want to see. Without thinking, I started to thumb the safety off. He turned his head to stare at me straight in the eyes. His teeth were showing, but it was not a snarl or a grin. I want to say it was a knowing smile. I knew I could place a killing shot, but I also knew it would be wrong, even criminal. He was saying to me with all the power of the spirit, "Leave me alone." It was as if more than one voice was speaking to me. It was a collective consciousness whispering with the same longing voice, "Leave me alone." One instant he was there, the next he turned and fled silently into the woods. At first I thought that it was a dream, but then I could feel the spirit like a mist in the forest, wanting to be left alone. Jacqueline said he recalled little as he ran and tumbled down the hill to the beach, hollering all the way. His partner, who was waiting on the beach, insisted he made the trip down in half the usual time. After daylight, the two retraced Jacqueline's steps up the hillside. The footprints he had followed earlier measured 17 inches long and 5 or 6 inches wide. The impressions left in the mossy ground convinced them that the creature had weighed 600 to 800 pounds. When they measured from the ground to the hemlock branch the creature had grasped as he turned, they found the distance was 9.5 feet. My messenger was 7.5 to 8 feet tall, Jacqueline said. He said the creature looked very much like the one portrayed in the movie Harry and the Hendersons. This one was equally as large, but more lean. He had long, silky hair. On his arm it was a good 6 inches long. He walked erect and he was quiet. He made no sound. He was graceful. His movements were graceful. I couldn't see his face too well, but it seemed like his skin was leathery. His eyes were dark. He had a glint in his eye. He had intelligence. A short time after that encounter, he said, the Wrangell sentinel carried a photograph taken from the air of the tracks of a two-legged creature in the deep snows of the mountains. Jacqueline, who was 40, was raised on a homestead in the Talkeetna Mountains and has spent his share of time in the Alaska bush. He realized that telling his story will convince some people he is more in the business of hot air than cold. But as he says, I've spent enough time in the woods to know the difference between when something is scaring me and I'm scaring myself. There's no question in my mind about what I saw. Twice more during the 5 years he trapped in the area, he became convinced the creatures were nearby and letting him know he was not welcome. A year and a half after the first incident, he set 40 to 50 traps in a new area rich with mink sign, only to come back the next day to find the traps had all been sprung. Thinking his adversary was maybe a crafty wolf, he moved some and reset some. When he returned the next day, the traps were again sprung, but there was a stick left in one, clearly not something one would expect of a wolf. Again he reset some of the traps and moved others. He returned the third day, again beaching his skiff in the same spot and following the same path to avoid spreading his scent. All his traps were gone. As he walked along the trail, pondering the mystery, he found himself following in what he thought were his own tracks. Then I realized they were alongside the trail, and that I always stuck on the trail. He said the stride was 1.5 my usual stride, 5 to 6 feet, and they left a deep impression in the moss. I realized it was the Sasquatch giving me a warning not to be in the area. As I launched the skiff, I heard a rattling sound in the water. I looked down, and the traps were in a pile by the skiff. Collins said he knew the area well, and knew there were no other people in the area. In spite of the signs, the area would provide lucrative furs, he said. The old trap sign he found told him it had not been trapped since 1939. I pulled out of the creek. I didn't disturb any other places in that area, he said. Sometime later, in another remote spot in the islands, he was in the process of putting together a cedar shake shed as a place to store his gear. He had felled a hefty cedar and was hand-splitting shakes from it when his dog began acting strangely. Henry wasn't afraid of anything, not even a wolf. Most dogs are terrified of even the smell of a wolf, he said. This time, the usually unruffled dog started to whine and crawled on his belly to the skiff. He climbed into the skiff without permission, something he had been trained never to do, and hunkered down under a seat. Colin at first dragged him out, but the dog continued to act terrified. That made me think. So I took a rifle and I walked in a 100-foot circle. Then I stopped. I knew I wasn't alone in the woods, so I got in the skiff and left. Motoring back later, he found the huge cedar he had been working on had been carried to the bank and dumped in the cove. Without going ashore, he turned the skiff around and left. I didn't want to give any indication that I would go against their will. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 2. Our sighting occurred on Thursday night, June 25th, around 11:15 p.m. Earlier in the day, Thursday, I set up a tent at Broken Mirror Campground to hold the place for the weekend and planned on returning Friday. Polecat and I decided to go back that night and got started from Heber, Arizona around 10:30 p.m. We reached the 9140 junction around 11:15 p.m. and turned left on 40. At approximately half a mile, the road turned right just a few degrees, and I sighted a group of trees, mostly ponderosa, and a couple of large white pines, and groups of small saplings limited the vision to the ground. I think we both saw movement at the same time, but I remained silent until she said, "Did you see that?" I said, "Yes, I saw it." I saw a large object, about 5 to 6 feet from a large tree, move directly behind the tree at a distance of 100 yards. The color was a dark brown and did not match the tree it went behind. It appeared to be a solid color with no noticeable feet because the small saplings were blocking the lower part. My headlights were set for pulling a trailer, so they are pointing down more than I like, so I did not notice a head. It just moved behind the tree in about 2 to 3 seconds in a smooth move and stopped. The width appeared very wide, maybe twice as wide as myself. The height could not be accurately guessed because the lights were set so low. No leg movement, but it was definitely tall and a possible bipedal because I have seen many elk in a similar sighting and never did stop behind a tree and hide. You would see either the tail or the head. This object stopped behind the tree, I would guess at 30 to 36 inch diameter, and nothing was showing on the other side of the tree. I stopped and backed up a few feet and turned the truck towards the tree and used the shoulder of the road to raise the lights. We waited about 5 minutes and saw nothing else, so we moved on down the road. Now I wished I would have thought to get out my night vision and 10 MCP spot and tried to use the camcorder, but you know how you think of these things after the fact, and at the time I had no firearm. I really regret I did nothing else, maybe because of the thought of the safety of my girlfriend. I did ask her if she saw any features, and she said she saw what appeared as a head, but no eye shine just before the movement, and the approximate height was 7 feet, so she did see it before I did. She is younger than me, and her eyesight's a little bit better, so I'll take her word for it on the 7 feet thing. Story 3. Two friends and I had traveled to the Huachuca Mountains of Cochise County, Arizona for some hiking and camping. We were limited on where we could go that year due to extensive wildfires. Having been blocked from going up Carr Canyon, we drove further down to Miller Canyon, where we were able to get off the beaten path a bit to sleep. The three of us slept in a small dome tent that we pitched about 20 yards off the dirt road. We did not see another car up on the road where we were that night. I awoke in the middle of the night to my friend sitting up in his sleeping bag yelling. The ceiling of our tent was mesh, and we could look through it and see the night sky. When his yelling awoke me, I asked him what was going on. He told me he just saw Bigfoot. I kind of smiled, but I could see the grave look on his face. I again spoke to him about his experience recently, January 2013, and he explained his experience thus. Dude, I saw it. I know what I saw and still remember it. I wasn't dreaming. It's just as vivid as when it happened. I looked up through the tent and saw its face looking at me. The moon was bright and behind where it was standing, making it hard to distinguish facial features. I could see a perfect silhouette. Its head was pretty long, and it didn't really have much of a neck. Its head seemed to just merge with its shoulders. It was big, at least 8 feet. It was standing over the tent, like it was leaning toward it and looking through the moon roof setting. I could see what looked like whites of its eyes. We stared at each other for like 30 seconds before it was gone. When the Sasquatch moved away, my friend yelled in fright. We did not attempt to leave the tent or go in pursuit of it. I have 100% trust in this friend. We joke around quite often, but I can attest that he is not joking with this. I believe his account to be authentic. I myself have been hiking in the Wasatch Mountains of Utah and had the distinct impression, almost tangible, that I was being observed. The feeling caused me to stop and look around, but I saw nothing. The feeling persisted, so I started to sing while I walked. I have been alone in the woods before, but this feeling was unique. I was bushwhacking through an aspen grove around Mount Pinogos at the time, which I am now aware has been something of a hot spot for sightings in Utah. I have since learned that this feeling of being watched is a common phenomenon that often precedes sightings. If I had known this then, I would have been more vigilant. Story 4. I want to tell you about the strange goings-on in the place I own out here in Prescott, Yavapai County, Arizona. We have the remnants of what used to be a working ranch from years ago. Some livestock left from those days, a few horses, a few Brahma, a couple of goats out there, and a longhorn I won in a bar fight in Mexico, down in Limestone County, Texas. And recently, we have a Bigfoot around. We used to winter horses for people around these parts who were snowbirds, but no more because of the mystery disappearances that happen here. In fact, lots of mysterious things like that happen around the place, especially as fall nears and the weather cools, like September, October, and November. Nothing happens in summer out here. One notable incident was the disappearance of one of my best dogs, part pit bull shepherd mix. He wasn't afraid of anything and was a great watchdog for the lower pasture. He guarded the grazing stock and 2 sheep we used to have, and the goats from local mountain lions and bobcats. Now you may say the dog wandered off, but he was 10 years old and never left sight of the main house. He was a devoted dog. Some have said a bear came in from the forest at night and took him, but my middle son found him exactly 14 feet up in the crotch of a pinyon tree with his neck snapped. No teeth marks found, no bear claw marks, no mountain lion tears, just a broken neck and tossed up into that tree. Or if not tossed, someone must have put the dog's body up in that pinyon, which my son had trouble reaching. We all tried to explain that one. Now on to the sheep. I bartered with a Mexican for a ram and a ewe, and had them down in the grazing pasture along with the stock, horses, goats, and such. We only had them a short while, and they disappeared. For a while we thought the previous owner snuck back here loading up the two and carried them off, but my wife ran into the fellow in the hardware store in town and talked to him about the disappearances. He came home that day with my wife, and together we went out looking for signs. We found nothing that day, and I don't believe he had anything to do with the sheep disappearance. He told me a far-out story that got me thinking, though, which is why I looked up Bigfoot on the internet. Anyway, he told me of a place up in the Sierra Preta Ponderosa forest where this Yavapai Indian woman ran a small flock of sheep in the company of young cousin, a blue merle coulee, and a border collie that kept her flock together at night, fending off attacks by mountain lions and bobcats, sometimes wolverines. This one season, the woman and her cousin were bringing the flock off of a mountain grazing. It was late October, and snows were expected. She said she was not feeling well and laid down in a grassy meadow to rest, but woke up when she heard the sheep bleating, her cousin yelling, and the dogs loudly onto something. The woman sheep herder said she got to her feet in time to see her two dogs biting at the heels of a big, hairy man, Soyoko, as he ambled off, escaping with a big ewe under his arm. The hairy man tried to fend off the biting dogs, kicked the one coulee dog all to hell. This might be what befell my dog. She called off the dogs and watched the hairy man disappear into the pine trees with his prize. He explained the hairy man to her was what we call Bigfoot or Sasquatch. She only told the story once to an elder, and she won't speak of it any more, but mentioned they come down from the north in winter. Hearing the sheep herder story, putting two and two together, my sons, the Mexican, and I pretty much decided that we must have a rogue Bigfoot living somewhere near the property. I don't mind that so much, and we don't mind sharing some of the fruit off our trees with them, but stealing a man's stock is another thing. I don't expect to put up with that. After reading up on websites, my boys and I, along with the other dogs, packed a rifle and a scabbard and rode out recently of a morning during Thanksgiving week and covered the whole western stretch of the property line looking for signs. You would laugh. We looked like a posse in a B-Western. We worked the edge of the tree line for about 2 hours looking for a trail. We found one that led into the deep forest, a section none of us had ridden before. We worked the horses through there, into the and around thick brush. Soon we came to a stream and stopped to gather our bearings and water the horses. Dismounting, I thought I heard someone cough. I asked, and nobody heard it but me. My horse jerked up, snorted, and became uneasy, sensing something none of us could see. The other mounts followed. All of us were focusing on keeping the horses under control as they danced around, bucking, kicking, and snorting. My sons thought mountain lion. I wasn't sure. We stood together there by the stream listening, calming the horses when the dogs started looking towards this thicket of tangled brush. Then the barking started in earnest and they took off. Still we couldn't see anything, but by now we all expected the dogs to tree a mountain lion. We couldn't follow, the brush was too thick, but the dog noise seemed to end about 20 yards into this thick brush and brambles. We kept calling and calling. Finally the dogs returned, and then took off again. Pretty soon the dogs returned with tongues hanging out, breathing heavy. We leashed the dogs up and took them and led the horses back down to the stream. The dogs settled down some, but the horses didn't, and as we were making an effort to saddle up again, that is when it happened. There came this howl that lengthened into a scream that at first sounded like a Brahma fart, low, guttural, and drug out, ending up in a high-pitched drone like a woman screaming bloody murder. My body reacted with a chill and goosebumps, mainly because the scream was coming from very close, somewhere in that thicket of the brambles where the dogs had been. The scream was so long and kind of drowned out, the kind of noise that gets your attention real fast. The Mexican yelled, "Soyoko!" Bigfoot, as he pulled out the rifle of the scabbard. By now the horses were almost impossible to control. Then it got quiet. Not a sound, no birds, no crickets, no nothing. Everything was very still except for the horses. The dogs were by now cowering between my legs, their ears pricked toward the thicket. Then in the distance we heard another scream. It must have come from across the next valley. Now we're figuring there's about to be two of these Bigfoot, and I felt fear for the first time. The dogs started whining. My grown boys hurriedly saddled up. We followed and took off down the trail, heading at a full gallop all the way home a good hour later. I never heard nothing like that before, and I've heard plenty of coyotes, plenty of wolves and elks bugle, but never nothing like that before. And it wasn't a mountain lion scream. It was 4 times as powerful. If that was a warning from Bigfoot, we got the message. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. We haven't paid much attention to the creatures. They aren't troublesome, scary, or mischievous like some report. Live and let live. This summer, my list of honeydew projects the wife gave me included building a small stepping bridge over the creek so we can get to the wild berry patch each spring without risking muddy shoes. We are too old to jump the creek anymore. I was hammering away, minding my own business, and comes lunchtime. The wife walks out the 60 yards to the creek, bringing lemonade and a sandwich. She says, "Watch your lunch." I was busy looking for where I put my leveler and paid little attention. I said thanks, and she went back to the house. I finished the lemonade and set the other half of the ham sandwich down on a 1x4 and moved over on my hands and knees to saw off an overhang. Just as I'm about to get the saw, I hear loud breathing and think the wife is behind me. I glance around and look straight at 2 hairy legs, not more than 10 feet from 2 25-pound sacks of quickset cement. It was our resident Bigfoot. He never came up this close before, and it startled me to be truthful. It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon on a warm and sunny Wednesday. The next few minutes were raw and intense, but I got a very good look at him. He's a big fellow, shiny gray bearded fellow. He commenced to squat down behind the wheelbarrow. He's too close, and I'm uncomfortable with him coming in that close. In front of this big fellow is a wheelbarrow, and beyond that a 50-60 yard clearing to the back porch. I tried to shoo him away by shouting, "Go home." Probably a dumbass thing to say, but he wasn't responding. It's a he. His knees were spread open in my direction in a squat position, so now I stand up and motion pointing to the area where he usually stares at from and wave and shout, "Go home." He watched me intently and fingered the box of nails set out on the ground. The thing I never noticed before at a distance was hearing him breathe. It's very loud and rhythmic, hollow sounding like breathing in a metal tube. Have you heard this? After that we stared at each other. It seemed like a long time, but probably wasn't. I remembered his eyes nervously twitched between me, the trees, and what was left of my sandwich. I felt there was another one in the trees somewhere, but I never saw it. I stood over him during the stare time, and then he finally stood to his feet and backed away, never taking his eyes off me. Afraid of him at that point, I quickly sat down cross-legged and watched his every move. My head was pounding. Then here is what I wanted you to know about. It was this part. After he stood up, he backed up to the other side of the wheelbarrow and stopped, stared, and then he reached down, grabbed a fistful of dirt and leaves and threw it at me. Have you ever heard of this happening before? Then he takes a few more steps backward and does it again. I don't know what that was supposed to mean, but at that point he turned and walked away at a pretty good clip, looking back at me twice. He went off to the area where we usually see him watching and was lost in the dense foliage and trees that surrounded the property. I am 68 years old and it still frazzles me. I told my wife about it. She said she saw the last part of it, the dirt throwing. I've read about rocks being thrown, but not this. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 2. This is a second-hand account that took place near Indianapolis, Indiana. The witness had just gotten off work early and was traveling down 200 north. One of his co-workers was traveling in front of him, a good 300 feet or so, when he noticed that he had swerved rather fast, so the witness expected a deer to come running out, but that was not the case. What he saw was a black-furred animal on two legs, walking all hunched over. He quickly tried avoiding it, but he believes he clipped it with his back end. He stopped, not sure what had just happened, and started looking in the driver's side mirror. He didn't see anything for a few seconds, but then something stood up right behind his Explorer. Terrified, the witness rolled down his window and could see the fear on his friend's eyes, who confirmed that he had seen the same creature. His friend started back to see it and heard it howling. The witness looked through the windshield and saw the creature trying to stand up on two legs again, but kept falling over. It eventually got on all fours and ran off into the woods. The two men then got out of their vehicles to look around, but did not see anything again. However, they noticed a large mouse-looking rodent on the side of the road, which was not afraid of them at all. They even picked it up and put it off in the grass. Story 3. A couple were mushroom hunting along Big Walnut Creek in western Indiana. The two had separated to cover a bigger area in the forest, looking for morel mushrooms. In Indiana, these are a gourmet delicacy and are sold for $20 to $30 per pound. The man was finding several remains of mushrooms that had already been picked, and he had decided that other mushroom hunters had already picked the area. His wife was finding the same thing, and she was losing interest in finding any mushrooms. She had decided that the mushrooms that had been already picked had been done so very recently. Then she spotted a very small one that had apparently been missed by the earlier hunters. When she bent over to pick it, she could hear a breathing sound. When she looked up, she could see a man. He was about 50 feet away and was staring at her. As she looked closer, she could see it was not a man, but as she described it, as a man/ape, covered in blackish brown hair, about 7 feet tall, standing next to a tree, and it was motionless. The more she looked, it became like a statue, completely motionless. She looked in the direction of where she thought her husband was, and when she looked back where this creature was standing, it was still there, except now it was completely behind the tree. All she could see was its shoulder. It was being very still. She yelled and started running through the forest in the direction of where they had parked their truck. Her husband hollered back, and he set out to find out what was wrong. When he found her, she was back at the truck, shaking uncontrollably. She told him what she saw, and he remarked that he kept hearing something following him, and he thought that it was his wife, and now he realized she had been looking for mushrooms in the opposite direction to where he was hearing footsteps and low vocal-like chatter. Story 4. Upon returning home from getting my husband some cigarettes in Cloverdale, Indiana, at the SR 243 exit off I-70, I traveled my usual path down a road called Jackie Dunn Hill Road. I had traveled down the road a short distance of maybe just over the third of the small hill, and saw something on the left side of the road. At first it appeared to be a black tree, but at the very edge of the road. I knew it was not a tree when it moved. Turning to face my headlights path, I could see a huge man-like thing, covered in black hair. Its face was very dark black, and I could not see much detail, but I could see it was man-like. Then it turned back towards the woods it was coming out of, and it took 2 very large gated steps and was out of my sight. It sent chills down my spine seeing it, and I could not go down that road without sense of fear. I used to hunt for mushrooms in the woods on the other side of the road, the way it was headed, but I will never go in there again. In fact, I will never go into the woods by myself again. I used to hunt mushrooms and squirrel, and I usually always went by myself, but not after seeing that. I have never been a non-believer in Bigfoot, but unless you have actually seen one, you are naturally going to have your doubts, just as I did. I can now honestly say that I have absolutely no doubts whatsoever that Bigfoots really do exist. Story 5. This story takes place in Morgan County, Indiana in 1983. A college student was attending Indiana University moved into an A-frame house in the fall of 1983 that was located on Low Gap Road, which bordered Morgan-Monroe State Forest. The home sat off the road far enough you could easily drive right by it. One evening he was visited by a couple of students that had stopped by to celebrate the start of the school year and whatever else occasion that would give him the excuse to drink a lot of alcohol. About 1:30 a.m., the young man that lived in the house decided to walk out on his deck to take a look at the full moon that was lighting up the forest. The moon was so bright it seemed like you could see every rock, tree, and blade of grass that made up the forest floor. He saw a possum that was waddling through the underbrush heading towards his trash can. As he looked down the trail that ran down the back of his house, he thought he could see someone walking on the trail, and they seemed to be heading towards his home. He squatted down and watched to see if he could make out who it might be. As the figure came closer, he noted this person was huge, and it looked like a football player wearing a fur coat. Then he thought, it's too warm to be wearing a fur coat. As the student watched this figure, he recognized this is not a person, because it is too big, it had no neck, and the walk was very unusual. The figure did not really swing its arms a great deal, and the arms were very long, and the stride was not human-like at all. Panicked, he ran into the house and told his guests to lock themselves in the back bedroom because they were about to be visited by something, and he did not know what it was. The student went to his gun cabinet and pulled out a machine gun that was part of his collection. He loaded the gun and walked out his back door. At first he did not see anything in the darkness, then he looked to his side and he could see a huge black shape standing at the edge of the forest. It was about 30 feet away. Without any hesitation he started shooting and sprayed the shape with several bullets from the gun. It seemed to slip into the woods and he could hear it crashing through the heavy undergrowth. He ran back into the house and announced to his guests that he had shot someone or something and to stay in the bedroom. The two guests said that when they heard the gunshots, something ran by their window, which was located on the other side of the house. The man told his guests that they would wait for daylight, then they would look for the body. They told him that they were not going to look for anything and they were leaving. He thought that if he had shot and killed a human, that he was going to bury it in the forest and not tell anyone. At daylight, he walked out of the house and he started looking for the spot where the shape was standing. He saw several shell casings lying on the ground, and he could see where the grass was mashed down from something very big standing on it. He also saw where it ran through the underbrush, and the trail was very easy to follow. The trail headed down a ravine, and all of a sudden it joined a very well-established trail that followed the ridge behind his home. The trail would go straight, and all of a sudden it would make a really weird jolt. This occurred several times, and when he got to looking, and he realized that every time it did, there were really low-hanging limbs. His conclusion that whatever was using this trail was so tall that instead of ducking underneath the limb, it was simply walking over it. The trail stopped at the top of the ridge behind his home, and at the end of the trail there was a bare spot on the ground about 20 feet in diameter. In the dust and mud, there were several human-like footprints, different sizes. One print was easily over 20 inches long. Looking around, he figured that whoever was standing on this bare spot had a perfect view of his home, and whoever stood in this spot could also see everything coming and going from his home. He never found a body. Story 6. I've been a skeptic most of my life, but I know what I experienced back in 1995. The encounter of what I believe may have been a Sasquatch occurred at a small tributary pond next to Moosehead Lake called Prong Pond. My father and I, along with a close friend, decided to give the small pond a shot at fishing since the smallmouth bass population was doing well. There was only one road into the pond, which ended at the only boat launch. The shoreline of the lake was underdeveloped and very heavy wooded, giving the pond a very secretive and eerie appearance. Once we set up camp at the boat launch, we got underway paddling to the other side of the pond to do some fishing. We were fishing for maybe a half hour when we all experienced a cry coming from the shoreline, which appeared fairly close, but could not pinpoint an exact location because of heavy fir boughs. At first, I had thought it was a bird of prey of some sort, then the screams took on a more human form, sounding like a laughing hyena, and they were very powerful. We continued to fish, but wondering what the hell was the crying like. When the sun dipped below the horizon, we set back to camp, had dinner, and talked for a bit around a campfire. My dad had mentioned that a good fishing guide friend some years back had told him that he was fishing the same pond and was close to the location where we had been that day, and saw a huge hairy creature stooping on the shoreline watching him inquisitively. Then the creature knew that he had noticed it, and stood up and turned to exit in the firs behind him, banging its head on a limb. My dad's friend, being startled and kinda creeped out, waited for a bit before pulling the canoe onto the shore. He measured the height of the branch that the creature had banged its head on, and it measured around 8 feet tall. He was pretty daring, 'cause you could never have gotten me to ever pull my canoe up on the shore anywhere near that thing. Having heard my father's story, raised the hairs on my arms. We eventually turned in, and though I was a little nervous, I dozed off fairly quickly. Around what I supposed to be 2 in the morning, I was jolted out of my sleep by a horrendous scream out in the woods to the left of the tent. The scream was similar to the screams we had heard earlier. I asked my dad and friend if they had heard it. They said they had been up for a bit listening to it. The screams went on for a while, then stopped, started again, sounding farther away. This went on for most of the night till morning came, and we decided to pack up and leave, which I believe was a wise choice. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed. Story 1. Having lived in the area for more than 4 years, I'd become accustomed to and familiar with driving my ATV, a Honda 450 Foreman, in and around the Daniel Boone National Forest. I was 22 years old and was dating a local girl who had lived in the county her whole life. We'll call her Pam. We left my house on October one night, traveled to the end of my ridge road, which is gravel, then continued on the dirt logging road, no longer in use at the time, which is privately owned. This road, of course, was wide enough to have at one time accommodated trucks and machinery used for logging. This old road goes on for maybe a mile to a mile and a half eastward before splitting into 3 separate roads, each having several arteries branching from them. We stayed on the eastward path that runs into Daniel Boone National Forest. From this point there is an old horse trail that the locals use for their equine excursions. We had traveled the entire horse trail and all the logging roads many times, and I felt intimately familiar with every nook and cranny these paths offered. Pam and I motored down the horse trail at leisurely pace due to the narrowness of the trail among the thick forest trees. This, coupled with the many twists and turns of the horse trail, one could rarely exceed 8 to 10 miles per hour. I know this because the ATV had a digital mile per hour readout that was backlit for night travel. After 200-300 yards, we came upon a small pond that sits on the south side of the trail. This was a favorite spot of mine. Many times I would travel to this spot at night, turn off my lights and engine, and just sit and gaze at the stars and take in all the smells and sounds this forest offers. I saw my first shooting star while gazing up into the fall sky the year before in this very spot. The small circular pond sits in a very tiny clearing of the forest just off the trail, with the tree line only about 20 feet from the water's edge all the way around. I pulled around to the side of the pond opposite the trail. Under a clear, half-moonlit sky, I turned off the engine and lights. I was oblivious that we had just parked near an entity that did not want us there. Fortunately, before we could even lift our butts off the seat to get off the ATV, there was a tremendous roar that came from the tree line directly behind us, and probably no more than 40-50 yards away. I was instantly terrified at this. It was a sound I never heard before. It was loud and near. Pam screamed, and I started up the ATV and headed back down the trail toward home. Luckily, the trail back out of there lay right in front of us. Holding on to me from behind, Pam remained silent as we made our escape. As quickly as I could, and without hitting any trees, we made our way back to the logging road a few hundred yards away. I never remembered turning my body to look back, but I looked from side to side many times. This model ATV has 3 headlights. 2 are in a fixed position on the four-wheeler's front, and a third is attached to the handlebars, and thus turned from side to side several dozen times as we made our way back to the logging road. From the pond to the logging road, I saw nothing unusual on either side of the tree line. neither directly nor in my peripheral. But remember, the horse trail is on forest property, and the trees are much more densely populated. Even with the ATV's lights and the half moon, my vision would have been severely limited. Neither of us shouted or spoke to one another during the retreat on the horse trail. During this time, I remember telling myself over and over that it must be some kind of animal or even a bird that had made that awful noise. Finally, after what had seemed like an eternity, we reached the logging road. It greeted us with a straighter, wider path that sparsely populated trees. Now comes the recollection that haunts my dreams to this day. Having reached the logging road without seeing or hearing any signs that we were being pursued, and not wanting to wreck, of course, I only moderately quickened our pace. Now, on the south side of the trail, something caught my eyes. I saw a dark figure running parallel to the road directly to my left about 30 yards. This thing was running on two legs. It looked like a very tall and large human form. I looked directly at it for a few seconds, turned back to look at the road, then turned and looked in its direction once more to discover it was still there, keeping pace with us. During the second and final glance at this being, which also just lasted a couple of seconds, it was one of these moments in life you wonder if what you're experiencing is real or just a dream. I looked down at my large digital backlit speedometer, 22 miles per hour. Finally, a moderately sharp bend to the south in the trail, I had to slow a little. As the road straightened again, I floored it, and for the first time turned my body to look to the left and a little behind to see if this curve to the left had allowed the creature an advantage, in case it was upon me or even in front of me. Nothing. It was not in close proximity to the left or rear. I even scanned the trees to my right. Nothing. I cocked my head to the side and yelled over the sound of the engine. "Pam, did you see it?" These being the first words we had spoken since the encounter. She must have thought my abrupt acceleration was due to the fact that beyond the sharp turn in the trail we just passed, the road did become more straight and smooth. Her response in my ear was, "I didn't see anything. Did you see something?" I said, "Nope," with intentions of telling her everything once we reached my house. I slowed my pace, and within minutes we were on the gravel road which led home. We went over the experience again and again that night, but I never told her what I saw. I sold my four-wheeler and moved to the city in the summer of 1999. I purchased another ATV in 2000. I bought a trailer and would pull my ATV to the 49 exit off I-75 and do my riding in Laurel and Rockcastle counties. I hauled my ATV back to the area I saw the creature on a summer day in 2001. I was alone. It went to the pond and stood on the bank for a few minutes. I skipped a few rocks and left. It was a beautiful day. Before I move on to the next story, I would like to point out that a majority of my viewers aren't subscribed. If you can just take a moment and hit that subscribe button, maybe click like or leave a comment, it'll go a long way in helping me fight the algorithm. You can always take it back later, and it's totally free. Now, back to the stories. Story 2. The male witness was sitting on his porch around 10:30 p.m. when he heard something coming from his apple trees. As he listened, it sounded like kids climbing in the branches. He hollered and heard what sounded like whoever it was must have jumped from the tree, landed on the ground and walking off. Not thinking much about it, he went inside his home. A little later, his dog became quite agitated and started growling and barking while looking out the glass patio sliding door. The man was watching television. He got up to see what his dog was so angry about, and he looked out the patio door. What he saw was quite remarkable. He saw the silhouette of a black ape-looking creature that had what he described as a head sitting on its shoulders with no neck. It appeared to be 7 to 8 foot tall. It stood motionless and stared at the man down before it turned around and melted into the darkness. The man who saw it called law enforcement, and they contacted me. There is one thing I did not find out until I did a follow-up interview. When the man heard his dog barking, he walked outside and he saw the creature. It was about 30 feet away. When he looked back toward his house, then looked back again, the creature charged. Now it was only about 20 feet away. Then it took off. He saw it again about 3 nights ago walking the field next to his house, and it was moving very quickly. Several people in the area have also seen it. This is just a short distance from my home as the crow flies, maybe 3 miles. This person informed me that while he was sassafras hunting and he found what appeared to be a nesting area on the ground that was several feet across and had been constructed of branches, twigs, and other debris. In the nest was different clumps of matted hair and fur. When he took his brother to the area a few days later, the nest was completely destroyed, and the hair and fur was gone. Has anyone else ever heard of anything like this happen before? Story 3. We used to live in Baileyville, Maine, but just moved to Millinocket. We thought you would like to know this story. We had dinner over Thanksgiving in 2006 with a group of 60 or more friends and relatives who lived over by Medibemps, Maine. This happened in Washington County, Maine. There was this couple down the long Thanksgiving table from us from Woodland Junction, Maine, who had driven down with their elderly mother and their aunt, her sister, both widows with some standing in their respective communities over there on the Indian Township Reservation. This is about all I know of them. I don't know what started the conversation as I got in on it after it started. Everyone was eating, the table grew quiet, and I heard this word used that got my attention. Medibemps howler. The two older ladies, we never got their names, too many people, were telling about when they were little girls, they went with their parents over there to Medibemps Lake to fish for smallmouth bass. Evidently the family went often. They said they were poor, didn't have fancy camp gear, slept under the stars, unafraid with their parents and uncle. They went on recalling how those were the days, and said as young girls had a favorite rocky island in the lake where they thought the fishing was best, and sometimes they would sleep at this little place in order to get first light fishing real early. Except when this howler thing started calling across the lake, then it happened either the uncle or the father would canoe out to collect them from the rocky outcrop. They explained the howling was more like a monotonous singing from someone with a husky voice, but it was called a howler. They said that for a long time they didn't know what the howler was, and that as children they just went there where they were told, until one day they were left alone on that rock island, and the adults went out quite a distance onto the lake to fish another area. The one lady remembers they had 2 biscuits left from breakfast, some worms and crickets to fish with until the mid-late afternoon. The older of the 2 little older ladies interrupted the other one to tell about when the howlers started singing again. Anxious for their parents to return, she said the 2 tied up the 3 smallmouth bass on a market string, placed them in a bucket of water, then waited and worried. The howling grew louder, and then she said it got quiet all of a sudden. The 2 girls looked around behind them, and there stood 2 giant Indians dripping wet. She said the giants stared down at the 2 of them and then reached over and took their catch. The bigger one walked over to the smaller giant and handed the fish to that one. The lady telling the story was gesturing with her hands. Then the black giants went into the water and swam away with the fish. This man sitting across the table from them, the 2 Indian ladies, asked how big the giants were, and they said 2 fathers high. The one lady said the 2 fathers high giants were covered in black shiny hair, and both giants were dripping wet and had huge hairy black hands with fingers as big as the fish they caught. They had big feet and had no clothing. At that recollection, the 2 ladies covered their mouth and sniggered. When the parents finally came in the canoe to pick the girls up, they were not very surprised at their story and told them that the Medibemps howler, who was known to steal fish and sometimes little girls, had visited them. After that, the girls were left at the campground area and never fished alone again. In fact, the one lady said they never went back to their favorite rock island to fish again. The description seemed close enough to Bigfoot to tell people about it. If there were other reports from the area that anyone knows about, I'd like to know. Story 4. A friend and I, he's a zoology student, decided to spend a part of our vacation walking the Bemis Valley Trail. It's a tough climb for those of us not used to frequent alpine climbs. Roughly like 12 to 15 mile loop through rugged country. The 4 peaks of the Bemis are breathtakingly beautiful in the autumn. We took a side trail down to Moose Look Maguntic. lake and arrived in time to watch the sun going down. We tacked down a two-man tent, and as we talked about turning in early, exhausted from the day's hike, we heard movement, then saw a huge man-shaped shadow approaching the water's edge of the lake. I asked Jim who he thought it was. We hadn't seen any other hikers around, and this thing was huge. We stared briefly, then he grabbed my hand. "Get in the tent," he said. "Why? What is that?" He shushed me to be very quiet, and we watched, being very still. The dark figure waded into the water and stood very still for the longest time. Then suddenly, like a shot, it took a header with its arms down by its sides, head first into the lake. It was a huge splash. The ripples faded along with the last rays of daylight, and yet we kept staring into the darkening lake with wonder. How truly bizarre. I'm not used to seeing anything like that. I'm a city girl. Jim, however, was raised in the country, is nature savvy, and seemed floored at what we just witnessed. I asked him if that could have been a big bear. He answered with a resounding, "No, that was no bear. It was no moose. It was the biggest man I've ever seen, or it was Bigfoot, but too dark to see details." I laughed and said there's no such thing. I read about that man out in the West somewhere that made up that story. But Jim insisted they do exist. We had just seen one dive into Moose Look McGuntic. He must have been right, because who would dive into that black as pitch lake at night? If it ever surfaced, we didn't see it. He got chills and started to shiver. He went quiet for a while, then said, "I wonder if you realize how rare what we just saw is." I didn't know what to say, but in my mind I thought he really thinks that thing was Bigfoot. He continued to shiver from exhaustion and probably excitement. As tired as we were that night, we didn't sleep much until almost dawn. Jim seemed awed by it. I didn't know what to think. We slept in until almost noon Sunday. We went down to the water's edge where this thing was last seen. There was one clear half barefoot print in the mud, pointing toward the water. The heel to the little toe showed, and Jim figured to be about 14-15 inches long, but longer at the big toe's end. The heel width was about 6 inches, but we had nothing to measure accurately but our hands and a flashlight. Neither of us could ascertain or be certain about the length, since the big toe and the second toe were under water and muddied. The heel depth was at least 3.5 inches deep. Jim was very quiet and reflective on the trek home, and preoccupied. During the drive he told me nobody would ever believe us. We ought to just stay quiet about the incident last night. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories. Hope you enjoyed.